This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be doing writing samples with my currently inked pens. I'll be doing my writing samples on the note pages in the back of a Hobonichi Weeks. The paper is 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, and it's not completely white, it's a little bit cream colored. I'm going to begin with the Pilot Lucina, and it has a gold-plated steel fine nib. I am thoroughly enjoying this fine nib on the Lucina. It's nice and wet, but not too messy. You still get that fine, crisp line, but the ink keeps up with the nib no matter how fast or how big you're writing. I had mentioned in my initial thoughts on this pen that I preferred the Prera over this body style, but it's really growing on me. I really enjoy writing with this pen, especially in my some lines a day. I got a Leuchtturm some lines a day for Christmas, and I just love writing in it. And when I'm writing with this fine nib, it makes me feel like this is the only nib size I need. If this were the only pen I had in my collection, I would be content. Next, I'll be writing with my red Pilot Legno. It has a 14 karat rhodium plated fine nib. Now, I've been having some issues with this nib, and I think it's due mostly to the ink, so we'll see how it does. You see I've got a little skipping there. Okay, you can see once it got going, it's not bad, but I've been having issues with this pen. If I leave it for a day or so without writing, the ink in the nib kind of dries up, but once you get to the wetter ink in the feed, it's writing okay. I'm also having issues with this ink not wanting to dry. Now, I've used Colorverse Dark Energy quite a bit in my fine nib that came in my Pilot Custom 74, and I never had any issues. I could go a few days without using it and it started right up. I never had any issues with the ink not wanting to dry. I think it's because I'm using it in this wood pen, and this red pen in particular feels more porous. There's not a lacquer finish over this wood like you see in some wood pens, and I think it just allows the ink to dry out. So I'll have to test some other inks in this pen before I say for certain that's what's happening, but I think that's it. Next, I'll be writing with my black Pilot Legno. It also has a rhodium plated 14 karat fine nib. Now, my black pen, one thing I noticed immediately about it is that the finish on it, also, it doesn't feel like it has a lacquer finish, but it feels like the wood is just less porous and it's smoother. So you don't have the ink drying out like you do in the red pen. Now, I may try switching these two inks the next time I ink them up and see if I still have the issue with the red pen drying out. See if it's the ink causing the problem or ink being able to evaporate through the pores of the wood. We'll see what's going on there. But the black pen has been inked up longer than the red pen, and the only ink in this pen right now is just the ink that is in the feed. I've used up all the ink that was in the converter, and it's been like that for several days. And I just had just the slightest bit of a hard start there, and then it wrote like a champ afterwards and was able to keep up. I've enjoyed this pen and ink combination quite a bit. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776 Century. It has a rhodium plated 14 karat medium nib. Now, I mentioned earlier with the Pilot Lucina fine nib that when I'm using it, I'm just very content with it. That's kind of how I feel when I write with this Platinum 3776 medium. It's such a nice nib to use with these shady inks like Rose Noir. It just looks so pretty. Oh, and I should have been doing reverse writing with these because this is a really nice reverse writer also. It goes from a really nice and precise writing medium to a really nice, consistent fine nib and very pleasant, not scratchy, a little feedbacky, but really pleasant to write with. So when I'm writing with this medium platinum, I'm also very content. Next, I've got a Fullywin 017. I replaced the Fullywin medium nib with this Nimacine 0.6 stub nib. I've been searching for quite a while for a pen that I could put this Nimacine stub in that would write well and that the feed would be able to keep up with the nib. I hadn't tried this pen before because I had trouble getting the Fullywin nib out. It was in there pretty tight, just friction fit, and I wasn't comfortable with the amount of pressure or the amount of force I was having to use to get it out. But I found since I've retired, I just haven't been using this pen. And I thought, well, it's worth the risk of doing some damage to the pen since I'm not using it anyway to try to get that nib and feed out because I want to try this Nimacine stub nib in it. And I was able to get it out. And this feed, It still has the issues that my Genhaos and the other pens that I've tried, the feed has a little bit of trouble keeping up with it for extended writing. It starts the ink looks a little more pale the longer you write. But with a nice saturated ink, dark saturated ink like this Monograppa Ravenclaw, it's not as noticeable. And so I've been using this in my Some Lines a Day journal and just enjoying it very much. And finally, I've got my Moonman M800. It has a Genhao stainless steel nib in it, and the size is unmarked. I've done some work on this nib and ground it into somewhat of a stub nib. Okay, so this is a Genhao nib that I ordered a batch of several just Genhao unmarked nibs from eBay with the intent of practicing doing some nib grinding. And I just find it so difficult to work on a nib that is a perfectly good writing nib. This was a really nice nib before I started working on it. And initially, I wanted to try to grind this into something like a Predator nib. I think Dan Smith is the one that does the Predator nib that is fine writing in the regular position and broader writing. I think a little bit of a broad architect nib on reverse. And I got it to where it decently wrote. The only issue is the reverse writing is kind of dry. So I tried working on it more and more and got it to where I didn't really like it and couldn't get it back to the state that it was where I was somewhat happy with it. So I ended up just grinding it into a kind of a fine stub nib. And I've learned a lot of things as I've worked on this nib. I've learned that I do not like glassy smooth nibs. I would get it to where it was kind of decent, but a little more feedbacky than I liked, and then I would smooth it, and it would just be so glassy smooth that I didn't really like it. In fact, on this Tomoe River paper, I'm less fond of it the way I have it right now than when I write on Leuchtturm paper. I prefer that feedback that I'm getting on Leuchtturm paper. Another thing I've discovered is that I had an easier time grinding the preppy medium nib into a stub than I did on this one, and I couldn't figure out at first what the issue was, and maybe I can show this, and I don't know if you can see this, but the nib slit is just slightly, almost imperceptible, but slightly off-sided. And it's amazing how much of an effect that has on the way the nib feels when you're writing with it. It makes the nib have more of a sweet spot. Also, the tipping on the nib was slightly lopsided. So when I ground it down to a stub, the sweet spot was shifted slightly to the left. It was just so many variables involved in grinding a nib and getting it to write correctly and comfortably and with the right amount of ink flow. This stub nib isn't perfect, and I think the next ink I put in this, I think this KWZ Honey, with it being a really shady ink, really brings out the flaws in the nib. I'm going to try it with a more saturated ink the next time I ink it up, and I think that will kind of mask some of the imperfections. Before I wrap this video up, it's been about 3 hours since I did this writing sample, and I came back and it looks like, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It looks like this Colorverse Dark Energy is still wet. Let's see. Yeah, and I'm getting little smears. And I got that. I don't think this is ever going to dry because yesterday I was doing some writing samples, testing the ink, and this morning when I came back, it was still smearing. So I think it's the pen because I've used this in other pens and the ink never got like this. But I'll do some more testing. And I've got a couple of honorable mention pens that I didn't include in my currently inked pens, but they're still inked. My Platinum Preppies, these have been inked for about 5 months. I went back and checked my older videos. You can see how there's just a little bit of ink stuck down in the bottom of the cartridges. And just what I have to do before I use them, I'll give them a little shake so that ball bearing will knock the ink down so that it's in contact with the feed. And I'm loving these because they just they start right up every time. Now I say that, and let's see if that's true. Yeah. This is the one that has the homemade stub nib, and it's got Iroshizuku Momiji. I'm doing reverse writing now. I love the reverse writing, that fine stub. I like the regular writing too. This is a very versatile pen. Here's a look at that homemade stub. And here's the other Preppy, and it has a homemade blade nib. If I can get it to focus on. Oh, I had a hard start there. And this is just a platinum black cartridge that came with the pen. So these are the pens that I've been using for the past couple weeks, using them for mostly just journaling, a little bit of note taking, and I've loved these. After my initial frustration with the M800, I'm enjoying it too, and I'm looking forward to using maybe a more compatible ink with this one. So if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.